Welcome to Beyond the Front Door podcast with Lindee and Rhea at Peak Properties. We are real estate agents in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and we bring you stories that make you laugh, cry, cringe, and inform you. Come on in. We put the real in real estate.
All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for listening in to today's episode. I would like to take a second to introduce Zach Valerio and Brett Kuhler. We have them from the Wyoming Economic Development Association and the Line team. And we're back here with Sam Weinstein and Rhea and I. This is part of our series on affordable housing and construction. So I'm going to let Rhea take over and ask the first question.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say welcome and thank you both for being here today. So I guess if we could just start off and have you each just briefly tell us a little bit about where you're from, how long you've lived in Cheyenne, if you want to share a little bit about your family, and your career trajectory up till this point, and what got you involved with what you're doing.
Tell us about how you live in Cheyenne. Oh, wait.
I certainly will.
Or maybe you don't live here. I don't know.
Yeah, so again, Brett Kuhler with the Wyoming Economic Development Association. I don't live in Cheyenne. I used to live in Cheyenne. I was born and raised in Casper, went to the University of Wyoming, lived in Cheyenne for several years, and now I live in Laramie.
Okay.
But our offices are based in Cheyenne at the Align team, and I've been in Laramie now for almost a decade. But we experience, I think, over the hills some of the same challenges that Cheyenne does, but also some of the same challenges that a lot of communities around the state face. Mm-hmm. And that's what's really cool about working with this organization is you get to see the differences, but also the comparisons that a lot of communities around Wyoming have. Specifically,
I'm excited
when it comes
for that conversation.
to housing.
Yeah.
You bet. And did I answer all your questions? I think I hit them all.
So what has been your I'm always curious, and this is personal. Yeah, I'm always curious what you did before this and what your degree was. Like, you know how it is. You know, you go to school to become a teacher, and then you become a governor. Or something like that.
Yeah. So I went to the University of Wyoming and studied communication. Sam actually was a GA of mine in public speaking. So hopefully we'll find out with this podcast how well that class was.
Is this a 2-hour podcast?
Yeah, that's right. We can keep it going.
Good luck, everybody.
Yeah.
But so I got my degree in communication. I left then to be to work in public affairs with the Wyoming Military Department, and then worked for the U.S. Senate for a couple of months before moving back to Laramie to then work in nonprofit fundraising, first for the hospital in Laramie and then for the University of Wyoming. I got my
experience.
It was, yeah. And then I got my MBA at the university while I was working there, and subsequently worked for UW's business incubator for just a little bit of time before jumping into this role in economic development. So a little bit of public policy work, a little bit of fundraising work and nonprofit management, and it all led to here.
I love it. That's a great path to walk. So
yeah,
can't wait to hear more. All right, Zach, how about you?
Yeah, mine isn't nearly as cool as that. So I've been in Cheyenne for about 11 years now, ever since like middle school. I'm from Gillette, then I moved out of state to New York. The state just for a couple
We're
years.
Also from
Gillette.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
So we hear Gillette and we're like, how did these people find us?
They do.
Right?
Birds
Oh
of
my
a
gosh,
feather
yeah.
flock together is all I got to say.
It's the Gillette magnet.
It is the
I think
Gillette
so.
magnet.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I spent a couple years in New York State, just a small town, and then we ended up moving back to Cheyenne. I've been here ever since. I went to school at LCCC first for small business management, and that was really interesting. That's actually where I met Sam originally for my small business that I was starting up. He was one of the judges and helped me get some seed money for my small apparel company. I then went to the University of Wyoming for entrepreneurship, which was like their first year doing it. It's a really broad program. So I was like, honestly, I have no idea what I'm going to do after this. Like, I want to have my own business, but I need some career work first. So as I was getting ready for graduation, I was looking for jobs. The Align team, I had a couple people say, hey, I think you'd be a great fit for this. And so I ended up applying, and Sam was actually, funny enough, on the hiring committee for that too. And with his kind words and also just some of my background, things like that, I was able to land the job at the Align team. So not a whole lot of career work built up to the Align team, but I've been there for about 2 years now, and I've worked with WEDA, I worked with SUBA, and various associations that just need an extra set of hands behind the scenes.
So I just have to jump in because I absolutely love Zach. This is how just absolutely small the whole world is. So I was a co-founder of the Southeast Wyoming Innovation Launchpad, which I'm sure you heard about in your time at the incubator. Essentially what we did was we tried to bring a startup challenge to Laramie County. And what we partnered with LCCC, and the incubator at the time was called Wyoming Business. It changes name so many times. Now it's like Innovate 307, I think is its name, potentially. I don't know.
The current one at
Yeah.
UW
Yes.
is Impact 307.
Impact 307. There we go. Really, really close. So Zach was he was an applicant in the startup challenge. And then we had semifinalists who went through essentially like a boot camp of about 8 to 10 weeks. Zach was one of those. And he just extremely coachable and excited. And it was like, I don't care what I have to do. Tell me what to do and I'll do it. And that is true entrepreneurial spirit. So as part of SUBA, the Southeast Wyoming Builders Association, we contracted with the Align team for our executive officer work. That way we didn't have to handle HR, hiring. I don't want to deal with any of that. So we were hiring for that role, and Zach was applying for that role. And I say this very openly because he has the job now. He wasn't right for that job, but I looked at everyone on the hiring committee and said, if you don't hire that, you need to hire him for something. I don't care what it is, hire him. And they literally said, yeah, I don't know what we have, but I think we're going to hire Zach for something. And that's just the type of people that you want, you know? So it's, never feel like you have to have all this experience, because it's not about experience. Sometimes it's just about the people.
Just mindset.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just the mindset. So, it's incredibly efficient for my life that 2 of the biggest boards I operate on are managed by the Align team. I spend probably half of my life at the Align building versus my own job.
Well, let's talk about the Align building for a
Yes.
second.
Yeah.
What a beautiful place. And so it's on the West Edge district. The only thing I'll say is, and I know you guys, that door remains locked when you first walk in, but the wind, I know, has to be a part of, I've noticed that the wind catches along that corner, but the inside of that building is just beautiful. And the artwork that is in there is just beautiful. So I love it in there.
It is, yeah. No, it's an incredible building. I've had the pleasure of working in a lot of spaces in my professional career, and if you go from a federal building to eventually ending up at the Align team offices, it's next level.
It doesn't suck.
Yep,
No,
it does not.
No.
Your building is gorgeous. I still
Yes.
think I have the best view in town.
Yeah.
I still think I have the best view in town.
It's a great building. So as part of our series, we are kind of trying to give our listeners sort of this 40,000 foot view of housing, affordable housing, building, and really and we're just kind of getting started here, but the overall message being is that we're all linked to each other. It isn't a black and white problem. It's a very gray problem that involves a lot of working parts and a lot of people and a lot of different industries coming together to be able to make sure that housing continues to be available for not only Cheyenne, but across the rest of the state. And so when we sat down with Sam to talk about that 30,000 foot view, he said Wyoming Economic Development Association has to be a part of that conversation. So,
Well, thanks, Sam.
yeah.
Well, as your vice chair on the board, I feel I should have said that earlier, but that's also one of the reasons. But no, I'm going to let Brett take this because I talk too much, but it was perfect timing when we sat down because we had just finished up a really fun event at the Capitol that WEDA partnered with SUBA on. So it made a lot of sense, and that's it. I'm gonna let Brett go.
Yeah. So tell us about what you do and how it relates to housing.
Yeah, so the Wyoming Economic Development Association's role is education and advocacy for economic developers throughout the state. So we don't specifically get involved in the economic development work, right? I'm not working with businesses to bring them to a specific community, but instead I get to work with the people who are doing that. So we provide conferences, networking events, a series of webinars and podcasts as well to help bridge the gap between the communities and the issues that they all see. I mentioned that most communities think they have a singular issue that no other community in the state of Wyoming has.
Oh my gosh. So my phrase around that is that every community in Wyoming thinks they're the redheaded stepchild of the state. And it is fascinating. And that their issues can only be solved locally. Like they're no outside influence.
You bet. You bet. And it's true that every community has their own set of challenges. And maybe the way that they solve them might look different than their neighbor.
Sure.
But generally speaking, a lot of the root causes of those challenges are the same. So when we talk to economic developers throughout the state, it's a workforce problem. And that could be because there's businesses that aren't hiring, or there are businesses that are hiring, but people aren't around to take those jobs, and there's nowhere for them to live, right? And so you really nail down these root problems and realize that they exist in almost every community throughout the state of Wyoming. There's a housing shortage that just is there, and we no longer can deny this problem exists. And so we then understand those problems, provide education around them, but just as importantly, when I say advocacy, that's my word for lobbying. We work with the state legislature to try and enact policies that make it easier for communities to address their challenges. We're a firm believer that there are things that can be done on a state level to address the challenges, but more importantly, if the state can do their best to stay out of the way, communities are then more empowered to address the challenges in a way that's unique and most beneficial for their community.
So can you give an example? Maybe I'm assuming you must have done something in the most previous legislative session. Can you give an example of something you did?
Yeah, so we worked on several different policies, but because we're talking today about the housing issues, that's the one that we were most excited going into the legislative session. Unfortunately, it's not a popular topic, right? When you look at the things that the legislature decides to discuss, housing isn't the one that they're then going knocking on doors and telling voters we fix this problem. It's not the exciting thing for them. Unfortunately, there were 5 or 6 pieces of legislation that addressed housing statute in the state of Wyoming, and we got one passed.
Yeah.
And then it didn't even get passed all the way. So it made it to the point of both houses passed it, but they passed different versions and wouldn't agree on it.
Well, and I always tell everybody, and I don't know when you started the process of a particular policy, but nothing ever happens the first year unless it's an emergency, catastrophic situation of some kind. It often takes, like, what I always try to explain to people, like when you present a bill, you're capacity building for the first year or two, right?
Yeah.
Like you're spending some time talking about it. It could take 3 to 5 years before everything. So how far into the process are you? Is this your first year introducing those policies, or? Great
question. Realistically, it is the first year. Housing policies have been a focus for many organizations across the state. The interim time between sessions there was the Joint Corporations Committee really dove in on some housing issues. We came up with what we thought were some potential solutions, maybe not the end all. And then of course the way elections work, those groups changed over, different faces on those committees, and so they couldn't carry the torch the way that group had spent months and months working on these issues. Unfortunately, we kind of see it as a 2-year pause now, though, in the legislative process, because next year being a budget year, you need 2/3 vote to even introduce these bills that, again, like I said, weren't the most popular topics anyway.
So I think I maybe interrupted you from telling us, like, what was the one that made it, like, what was the concept behind the one that made it the furthest?
Yeah, so there's a bill called Zoning Protest Petition Amendments. So to just as quickly as possible explain what that does. In a community, when a zoning change occurs, the governing body, whether that's a city council, county commissioners, whoever it is who makes that decision, if they pass that process, they pass that zoning change, individuals in the community can create a petition to challenge that zoning change. And if they do so, it raises the threshold from a majority vote by that governing body to a 2/3 vote. Our goal was to get rid of that process, if possible, get rid of that process altogether. Though it's really what I would consider a NIMBY process, right? You've decided you're going to build this development in my backyard, and I don't like it there. And most people would say, yes, we do have a housing problem. Just don't
Build
fix
it near me.
near me. And so we want to get rid of that process altogether, if possible. The goal of that was to lower the threshold of votes back to a majority, and increase the threshold of the people required to sign that petition. Right now, it's incredibly low. And so we wanted to have more people would need to sign the petition and fewer votes required to still pass the development. Again, that was changed by the House of Representatives in the end to a completely different bill, and the two groups didn't agree on what it changed to.
So I just want to sum this up in layman's terms, or for my own head, I guess. So what you were proposing, and this is not, I hope this comes out correctly. What you were proposing is that if I live in a certain area and somebody is proposing a development near me, that it will actually become tougher for me to fight against that. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. Yeah. And so I appreciate you asking the clarification. Yeah. The process currently exists in every community around the state that you have to have 3 readings on a change with multiple public hearings and all the stakeholders at the table.
Right.
So that process exists. This was a maybe you missed the meeting and you didn't get a talk on that process, or you decided after you saw the result of that process that you didn't like it. This was in in some way sort of a last ditch effort to really derail development projects, is the way it currently exists. So multiple readings, multiple public hearings already exist. Mm-hmm. And if the outcome is one you don't like after following the entire process, this is one more chance to take it off the agenda from actually ever happening. And we've seen it happen in communities around the state. Again, go over the hill. If we look at the city of Laramie, this is an exact thing that happened. The city of Laramie was looking to build a multi-use apartment in their downtown space. The development was going to move forward until this situation, this zoning protest petition was filed, which then required out of their 9 city council members, 7 of 9 had a vote in favor of it. And so because they couldn't get 7 city councilors to vote yes, that project completely died. And it happens after a number of things happen locally to make this development come to life.
So I'm going to pause there because we had the same issue in Cheyenne on the property up on Ridge Road. And I think the thing that is most frustrating that I want everyone to understand is that these are private companies using their own dollars to develop and do something on land that they purchased, and now it's a property rights issue from at least my perspective. I will let my director speak, but from a board member and constituent of the state of Wyoming, it fascinates me that we are a state where everyone can just do what they want to do. You do your life, I do my life, and we really preach that. But then all of a sudden, someone wants to bring in their own money and fix an issue that was occurring. There's an issue in Laramie. There's an empty spot. There's lost revenue, and there's a lack of housing. Perfect situation. We have a flooding problem. We have a traffic issue. We have a safety problem because roads aren't paved. There's hundreds of thousands up to millions of dollars then wasted by these private developers that are trying to use their own money, because people need to understand when you buy a lot, you then have to survey that lot, you have to engineer that lot, you have to maybe run an environmental report on that lot to understand it. Then you start paying your architects and your builders and your scrapers to go in there and actually start moving things. You have to get all those plans approved. You have to get your infrastructure plan, your roads, your streets, your gutters, all of that. And it's increasingly frustrating to me that if we are a state that prides itself on personal responsibility and doing our own thing and having your own rights, why is it you have a right to say what someone else does in an empty lot? What I tell people is if you like that view, better buy it because you don't own that land. you know, and it's frustrating because I was at the meeting a couple years ago when that happened here, and I left, and there were people in the parking lot cheering this on. They were so excited that this wasn't happening. And I yelled across the parking lot to them, and I said, you better stop complaining that no one wants to work. You better stop complaining that your lines at McDonald's or Starbucks are too long because there's not enough employees, because it is a huge Venn diagram. And I know I say this on every show I'm on with you. It's this huge Venn diagram. And we have to understand that if we don't put it there because you don't want it, where do you want it? Put it in my backyard. I welcome it.
Right.
You know, and I think it's also an education thing where when you move to a location, you should be aware of that development and what is happening. You know, I bought a house in Sweetgrass. I read the site plan before I moved in. They're throwing up fourplexes every other day, and I'm loving it. I have neighbors that are complaining nonstop, and I'm like, did you even read the site plan?
Yeah.
And they don't. It's like, so you're complaining about something that you very well could have understood before you walked in the door. But the zoning protest thing, sorry for my rabbit chase, we have people that are coming in to solve problems for us, and we're saying no because we don't like the style of the building.
Right.
You know, or I always hear, and I'm sure you do across the state, I don't want those kind of people. You know, this morning we had Gunnar Malm, and he mentioned, you know, when you say affordable housing, people have this negative connotation about it.
Yep.
You know, so I think they get very concerned, but I remind everyone that we probably all at one point lived in affordable housing.
Yes.
You know,
we need it.
Yeah.
You know, and it doesn't mean dingy, rundown, you know, not aesthetically pleasing housing. It means that we're trying to provide housing to all income levels. And everybody
100%
deserves that right.
100%. Sorry for my tangent.
Hey.
I'm just very passionate about the idea that you should have your own personal property rights. I'm all for that. However, this is I don't know how big the parcel was over in Laramie, but I mean, these are huge pieces of land that were up for sale. If you wanted to do something about it, you could have had the chance to do something about it. You know, and it's frustrating, but I think it's just continuing the conversation and making sure people realize that they need to come to the table to have the conversation. That's the other thing. I think the majority of the people that would be part of that protest, unfortunately, aren't the ones that come to the table to have conversations.
Sure.
So how do we get those people to the table for a conversation? Right.
And hopefully I'm not opening a can of worms by saying this or suggesting this, but I feel like I've heard this similar conversation around, like when county commissioners, when people buy up private land outside of town, a few acres or many acres or whatever the case is, and they decide to put up, for example, the wind farms, right? That's another example where those private property owners decide to put up wind farms. That's their right, and that is a conservative value, right? That you're in charge of your own property, you get to make your own decisions, blah blah blah. But then there's this other side where people are unhappy that we have wind farms because Wyoming is so mineral rich and mineral dependent that there's this, you know, anti-wind farm situation. And so then
if I had enough money to buy a piece of land, I would let them I don't think people understand the amount of money you can make by putting a windmill on your property. So you can have all the hate in the world, but it's the same reason why there's a lot of farmers and ranchers that have Verizon poles or AT&T poles.
Yes.
They're not pretty, but it not just helps, but it's a source of income. It's revenue. I don't use the word tax. We were taught revenue.
Well, and
revenue.
And I think that does go back into Wyoming values. We want our citizens to be income producing. We want our citizens to be sustainable and take care of themselves and not rely on the government, right? And we also want our citizens to have the freedom to do with their property what they want to do. And I hear what you're saying, because it sounds like that if people disagree with the decision that you're making, that they can come in and change what you have decided. It is
at the last minute, right?
Right.
Like
At
they've
the
done
last
all
minute.
the things and
Correct.
jumped through all the hoops, and at the end, someone can stop it.
And all this money is invested.
Correct.
Yes.
And the way that the statute currently exists is there's no timetable to that petition that that you can file, right? And so when you say last minute, it could be very last minute, right? Shovels could be moving dirt, property could be changing the way it looks, and that petition could be filed. I mean, it is absolutely the statute itself was created at a time where cities and counties and towns didn't have regulations for their zoning processes. And so the state decided to do something wide-ranging that would help out all of the communities. We've gone a long way since that was created, right? Towns, counties, all have their own set of ordinances and regulations on how they do these things. And so this is an absolutely unneeded additional step. And like I said, it really is I missed the meetings, or I didn't like the outcome, and so I'm going to throw one more chance at trying to stop this from happening.
That's unfortunate.
So it's obviously deterring these developers and people from coming in and trying to build these properties, or what?
Yeah, the one that was here in Cheyenne was a local builder.
Okay.
It's just not the way that I thought Wyoming does business. I thought we treated our own, quote, our own better than outsiders. We talk all the time at SUBA. We're pro builders, but we are pro our local builders. There were conversations a few years ago about a major builder coming to town, and that caused some consternation. But all of this is about trying to keep things local. So I think it's unfortunate that we as a community, I'm not even going to say our elected officials, we as a community, the constituents of Cheyenne, treated a local business terribly. And instead, who knows what's going to happen to that property? I mean, here's what's frustrating. Someone, based off of the rules of that land, someone can go up and open up a gas station. So they're more okay with a gas station being right next to their house than an apartment complex, which just doesn't make sense. And to go back to the idea of conservative values, how would these homeowners feel if that contractor got to say, hey, you know what, your houses, I don't like the color, and I'm going to put up my buildings, but I need you guys to match my color. Some of you have trees I don't like. Your fences aren't the right height. And they would pull out their pitchforks and torches, and they would chase them like Shrek.
Well, and I think that people forget, too, just about the power of eminent domain, and that always is lurking in the background.
Yeah. It is just, it's fascinating, and it's frustrating. And I am all about people protesting. I want your voice, but I want it in a productive fashion that makes sense and doesn't allow a small minority to disrupt a multi-million-dollar project that would have benefited our community.
That would have addressed a big issue.
I mean, here's the other thing. Let's talk about revenues. Brett, you probably know this answer. How much money does the state of Wyoming receive from raw land?
Yeah, I don't think it's much.
Right, exactly. What happens if you put real property on it? It skyrockets the value. And all of a sudden, there's revenues coming into our state and coming into our county and coming into our cities and our municipalities. And I get it. It's tough to have a giant building right next to you, but where are we going to put our workers?
Yeah.
I mean, it's always going to be a chicken and egg conversation of what do we do first? Who do we help first? But trying to just explain the process to people, I think, is probably what, at least my perspective of a board chair, vice chair, that's our next 2 years, because next year's the budget, and we need to start focusing on getting the conversation to the state about saying we're all saying the same thing, but in a different way across the state.
Yeah.
And I think what WEDA is trying to do is that we are trying to provide that voice as one. And it's tricky because we're very independent communities.
Yes.
And it is, I mean, I'm glad Sam said chicken and egg, because that's one thing that we work as hard as we can with local communities about the idea that these challenges that they face are so monumental that they don't know where to start. And what's interesting is if you don't ever take a step, then you're just in the same exact spot you were in, right? And so we understand that these problems are multifaceted, and they have a lot of different pieces to all of them. But taking a step at all, and seeing if you can start to see other dominoes fall is way more important than just being overwhelmed by the issues. And I will also say I'm glad Sam brought up the empty lot question, because one of the other pieces of legislation we were really excited to have discussed, and it wasn't really discussed at all, was on tax increment financing, which is a one of very few tools that Wyoming economic developers have in their pockets when it comes to addressing blight, is what it's referred to in the current state statute. So how do you help incentivize, is maybe the wrong word to use, certainly with the legislature, but how do you help motivate somebody to develop on a property that's blighted or run down, and the strictly the costs for taking out what's currently on that land is too much for them to start, and so a lot of places around the United States use those tax increment financing mechanisms, which allow you to essentially take a little bit of help in the process to get rid of what's currently there and start building, because then again you'll have someone occupying a space, then paying property taxes on that
And bringing
space,
in revenue.
enhancing the value of the land around them by having a better situation on that blighted land, and all of it just raises the outcome.
So that particular concept was the state of Wyoming helping with the removal of the blight, so to speak, on that land.
It's kind of, sort of, but not quite exactly.
Okay.
So tax increment financing is allowed currently in the state of Wyoming, but it's only allowed for very specific uses. Housing is not one of them. So if we were to go down here in Cheyenne and just head on towards I-80 off of Lincoln Way, and you see what was the hitching post land, and the amount of development that's occurred there, that is a direct result of the tax increment financing structure. Essentially what it does is it asks the city or a specific district, in a lot of areas it's an urban renewal authority or a downtown development authority, to take tax revenue that they were getting, allocate it towards a specific purpose, and once that amount of money that's been committed is paid off, then the tax revenue that organization is receiving is unfrozen and then allocated as it used to be allocated across a variety of different areas, including weed and pest districts, your fire districts, all of those things. So, I mean, property tax is sort of a complicated set of revenues, but essentially it uses current property taxes that are in existence, uses the increased value in assessed land, and pays or helps pay for the project itself. And we're not talking the first 10 to 95% of a project. It is a get across the finish line revenue source.
I see.
And is the one thing, like I said, that will attract a developer to do something like this. And what's interesting is when you look at the state of Wyoming, you asked about are these policies chasing out developers? And the answer is absolutely yes. We do love the local developers that exist in Wyoming across the entire state, but some of these problems that we're looking to solve are going to require some help. And they're going to require some help outside of our four borders. And when you look at national development companies specifically for housing, Wyoming has one that works here, and it's Habitat for Humanity. And so
that is my favorite trivia question when I walk around and ask people. I ask them, I'm like, who's our largest builder in Cheyenne? And then they all name these other companies. I'm like, no, it's Habitat. It's wild because they're a national builder. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I was thinking it's wild.
So I mean, we're gonna have to employ the know-how and the resources of our local developers and developers outside of Wyoming to address the problem that we're facing, because it's gotten that large.
I think that, and we talked about this in our conversation with Gunnar, and I have a funny feeling it's going to come up in every single conversation, is that there's, especially with what's happening on a national level, there's a very strong movement towards keeping conservative values, and that it sort of overpowers growth, so to speak. And I've been saying, really the goal, I think, is to balance those two things, right? To keep conservative values, but still allow the growth that needs to occur to accommodate and take care of the people that live in our state.
Yeah.
But I think one overshadows the other is what I'm kind of hearing, and what I think we're
Or
going to
people
continue to hear.
believe you can't have one or the
Yeah,
other.
You're
that-
right.
Right, that it's one or the other.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Betsy Hale, who's the CEO of Cheyenne Leads, the local economic developer here in town, will say economic development does not equal population growth. You can invest in your community and make it a place worth living and working in without growing your population. And I will say WEDA as an organization does not hate the idea of population growth, but that's not what's
what your
required.
goal is.
Yeah,
Right.
our requirement for a strong economic development infrastructure in the state of Wyoming is a place that people like to live and work.
To
and
improve the
play.
quality of life
Absolutely.
of the people that are living here. Right?
Absolutely. And so we you hear it all along the I-80 corridor, but especially on this side of the state, we don't want to be Fort Collins. Well, here's a fun tidbit. In the 1960s, Laramie and Fort Collins were relatively the same population. And so we're fast forward now 65 years to 2025, and Fort Collins is the size it is today. So the moves we make today are not going to turn Cheyenne or Laramie into Fort Collins at all. But it can hopefully do a better job of retaining the people that live here and stop sending them down to Fort Collins.
Yep. What I always find so interesting is, so in my previous life, I used to travel around the state and got to know all the communities pretty well. And Wyoming as a whole really embraces the rural nature of the state. And so, like, for example, even when I was moving here, people were like, oh my God, I can't believe you're moving to the big city. And I'm like, that is nuts to me. Cheyenne, I mean, I understand Laramie County is about 100,000 people and growing. I get it. 100,000 people in Laramie County. That's not big city. We don't have big high rises. We're not dealing with pollution. We're not like Denver is, we're not, those things just are not happening here. And I just find it so fascinating that people call this a big city, because I just don't see it as that. Now, sure, I guess it is a big city compared to Moorcroft, Wyoming, or Kemmerer, or
Man, those people in Moorcroft and Kemmerer are going to be real mad that they got called out.
But I mean, I get it. You got one street running through town and one gas station and one grocery store, and everybody. We actually had Michelle Aldrich on here telling us that back in the 50s or 60s in Lusk, where the newspaper used to report on if there were so many cars at somebody's house. Like somebody had hosted a dinner and this somehow made the news. Like that's the type of, and she was telling us that this was how it was in Lusk forever and ever in their newspaper. And so I think but that's a great example of growth. Like maybe we shouldn't be reporting on those things in the local newspaper, but it doesn't mean that you're all of a sudden a big city now. But Cheyenne is, it's definitely the biggest town in Wyoming, but it's still a town.
It is. No, it absolutely is, and you do have a real opportunity to. I think attracting people to Wyoming is one thing, but trying to keep them here is the place we're struggling the most in. In going back to the protest petition bill itself, we had a legislator who was discussing that bill, and he gave an anecdote of his daughter was one of those people who had to leave their town, the town she grew up in, because there was nowhere for her and her family to live. They couldn't find a house within their means, followed by the comment of, but I don't think we need to build more houses, right? And so we're almost doing this to a fault, where we love the rural nature of Wyoming. We want it to stay exactly like it is. But if we do that long enough, we're going to look around and be the only ones who are here.
Yeah.
Because you can't keep the people, you can't retain them. One of our biggest exports are people aged 20 to 35.